Custer County, Nebraska, November 1888. While his neighbors reinforced their log cabins with conventional methods, daubing cracks with clay, stacking firewood, preparing for another hard prairie winter, 63-year-old Jacob Steiner was doing something that made absolutely no sense to anyone watching. He was covering his walls with hay. Not just a little, 18 inches of compressed prairie grass, bound tight with willow withes, layered against every exterior wall of his sod roof cabin. His neighbors watched from a distance, shaking their heads. Some laughed openly. Others whispered that the old German had finally lost his mind. Steiner's building a barn around his house. One local carpenter joked at the general store. Guess he figures if he's going to live like cattle, might as well insulate like him too. But Jacob Steiner wasn't crazy. He was remembering winters in the Bavarian highlands where his grandfather had taught him something the Nebraska homesteaders had forgotten in their rush to claim land and prove up their claims. Something about how the poorest mountain families, the ones everyone pitied, somehow kept their children alive through winters that killed the livestock of wealthier neighbors. What did this old rancher understand about thermal physics that frontier builders with 20 years of Nebraska experience had completely missed? Before we reveal what happened when the worst winter in half a century arrived, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Because what you're about to learn could literally save your life if the power grid fails this winter. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I want to know how many of you are already living off-grid or preparing to. Do that now, and I promise you'll walk away from this video with knowledge that most modern engineers have completely forgotten. Jacob Steiner had come to Nebraska in 1871 with his wife Anna and 4 children, part of the great wave of German immigrants who traded the crowded valleys of Bavaria for the endless grass ocean of the Great Plains. He'd filed his claim on 160 acres of mixed grass prairie along the North Loup River, built a dugout first, carved right into a hillside like his ancestors had done in the Alps, then graduated to a proper sod house by 1874. By 1888, he'd survived 17 Nebraska winters. He knew cold. He knew wind. He knew what it meant when the cattle turned their backs to the northwest and refused to graze. He'd lost 2 children to scarlet fever in the winter of 1880, when temperatures stayed below zero for 11 consecutive days and the doctor couldn't get through from broken bow. That's what his neighbors didn't understand. They saw an old man doing something strange. He saw a father who could not, lose another child to cold. The technique itself seemed primitive, almost laughably simple. Starting in late September 1888, Steiner began harvesting prairie hay from his own land, big bluestem, Indian grass, switchgrass, cutting it before the seed heads fully matured, while the stems still held maximum fiber strength. He let it cure for exactly 2 weeks, not the usual 4. Slightly green hay, he'd learned in Bavaria, compressed tighter and resisted rodent damage better than fully dried grass. Then came the construction that made his neighbors smirk. Against each exterior wall of his 20 by 24-foot cabin, Steiner built a secondary frame of vertical willow poles, spaced 16 inches apart, driven 2 feet into the ground and rising to the roofline. Between the original log wall and this new frame, he packed the hay in layers. Compress, bind with willow withes, compress again, bind again, creating a continuous 18-inch barrier around the entire structure. 18 inches, his nearest neighbor, Thomas Bradley, said with unconcealed contempt. That's 18 inches of fuel for the fire when lightning strikes. 18 inches of rat hotels and snake dens. 18 inches of stupidity. Bradley was the closest thing Custer County had to an expert builder. He'd constructed 14 cabins in the region, served as the informal building inspector for the township, and made extra money consulting on chimney design. When he saw what Steiner was doing, he rode over specifically to talk sense into the old German. "Jacob, listen to reason," Bradley said, sitting his horse outside the half-completed hay wall. "That grass is going to wick moisture right into your logs. Come spring, you'll have rot from ground to roofline. And in winter, the mice will tunnel through it like it's cheese. You're creating more problems than you're solving." Steiner paused his work, wiped his brow, and looked up at the mounted man with the kind of patience that comes from decades of being underestimated. In the Bavarian highlands, Herb Bradley, the poorest families lived in houses half buried in the earth, with walls 3 feet thick made of stone, mud, and grass. The rich families, they built tall houses with thin walls and big windows, yes? Impressive to look at. He returned to compressing another section of hay. Every winter, the poor families stayed warm with one small fire. The rich families burned through cords of wood and still woke to ice on their wash basins. You tell me, who were the stupid ones? Bradley had no answer to that. He rode away, shaking his head, certain that come spring, he'd be helping rebuild Steiner's cabin after the whole experiment collapsed into moldy ruin. By mid-November, the work was complete. Steiner's cabin looked like a house wearing a massive grass overcoat. The hay walls rose all the way to the roof overhang, creating a continuous thermal envelope with no breaks except for the door and 2 small windows, which Steiner had also modified, adding external shutters packed with 6 inches of compressed grass. The final touch seemed even crazier than everything before it. Steiner dug a trench 3 feet deep around the entire perimeter of the cabin and filled it with smooth river stones he'd hauled up from the North Loo, nearly 2,000 pounds of them, carefully selected for size and density. When asked why, he simply said, "Grandfather's way. Stone holds what wood forgets." His wife, Anna, understood. His children, now teenagers, helped without question. But the rest of Custer County had seen enough. At the general store, the verdict was unanimous. Old Jacob Steiner had wasted an entire autumn building the most foolish structure in Nebraska territory. Come December, they said, he'd realize his mistake. Come January, he'd be begging to winter with neighbors in a real cabin. They had no idea that in less than 8 weeks, every single one of them would be begging to shelter in his. What Jacob Steiner had built, though his neighbors lacked the vocabulary to describe it, was a near-perfect example of what modern engineers would later call a superinsulated thermal envelope with integrated thermal mass. The hay itself, 18 inches of compressed prairie grass, had an R value between 3.5 and 4.0 per inch. That meant his walls had a total insulation value of approximately R 63 to R 72. To put that in perspective, a standard log cabin of the era, with 8-inch pine or cottonwood logs chinked with clay, had an R value of maybe R8 to R10 for the entire wall assembly. Steiner's walls were 7 times more resistant to heat loss than the best conventional construction in Custer County. But the genius wasn't just in the insulation value. It was in how the system worked as a whole. The compression was critical. By packing the hay tight, so tight that you couldn't push your thumb into it, Steiner had eliminated air gaps. Loose hay is actually a poor insulator because air can circulate through it, carrying heat away through convection. Compressed hay stops air movement almost completely, trapping warmth in millions of tiny pockets between the grass fibers. He'd bound the hay in horizontal layers every 8 inches with fresh willow withes, green wood that would shrink as it dried, actually tightening the compression over time rather than loosening it. Each layer was oriented perpendicular to the one below it, creating a crosshatch structure that prevented settling and maintained uniform density from ground to roofline. The moisture management was equally sophisticated, though Steiner had learned it through inherited knowledge rather than physics textbooks. Prairie hay, especially when harvested slightly green, contains natural waxes and silica that make it surprisingly water-resistant. When properly compressed and kept ventilated at the top and bottom, which Steiner achieved by leaving a 4-inch gap between the roof overhang and the top of the hay wall, and by elevating the bottom 6 inches above grade, the grass actually shed moisture rather than absorbing it. Thomas Bradley had been wrong about rot. The hay would last for decades. But the most advanced element of Steiner's design was something that wouldn't be formally understood by building science until the 1920s, the integration of thermal mass with high insulation. Those 2,000 pounds of river stones buried in the perimeter trench weren't there by accident. Steiner had positioned them directly below the exterior walls, creating a massive heat sink that surrounded the living space. During the day, when the cabin's small cast-iron stove burned, radiant heat from the floor and walls would slowly warm those stones. At night, when the fire died down to coals, the stones would release that stored heat back into the space for hours, sometimes 6 to 8 hours of passive heating with no active fire at all. The specific heat capacity of sandstone and limestone, the type Steiner had selected, is approximately 0.2 BTU per pound per degree Fahrenheit. That meant his 2,000-pound thermal mass could store roughly 400 BTUs for every degree of temperature increase. If he warmed those stones by just 20 degrees Fahrenheit during the day, they'd release 8,000 BTUs overnight, equivalent to burning about 3/4 of a pound of dry wood per hour, without burning anything at all. Modern passive solar designers would recognize this immediately as a batch thermal storage system. Jacob Steiner just called it grandfather's way. The cabin's compact footprint, 20 by 24 feet, or 480 square feet, was also deliberate. Smaller spaces have a lower surface area to volume ratio, meaning less exterior wall through which heat can escape relative to the interior volume being heated. Steiner's cabin had 1,088 square feet of exterior wall surface, including roof, enclosing 3,840 cubic feet of space, a ratio of 0.28. A typical two-story homestead cabin of the same era, with similar floor space but stretched vertically, might have a ratio of 0.45 or higher. Every square foot of wall surface is a pathway for heat loss. Steiner had minimized his thermal boundary. Even the window shutters revealed sophisticated thinking. 6 inches of compressed hay packed into external shutters meant that at night, when windows lose heat fastest through radiation and conduction, Steiner could reduce those losses by 85% or more simply by closing the shutters. During the day, he could open them to gain some passive solar heating through the south-facing windows, then seal everything up at dusk. All of this added up to a structure that required, by Steiner's own calculations recorded in a letter to his brother in Bavaria, less than half the wood of my neighbor Bradley, and we stay warmer even on the coldest nights. But Bradley and the other frontier builders of Custer County couldn't see any of this. They saw hay. They saw something that looked like a barn. They saw a technique that had no place in modern frontier construction, which prided itself on straight-cut logs and tight chinking and chimneys that drew properly. What they didn't see, what they refused to see, was that Jacob Steiner had just built the most thermally efficient residence in 200 miles of open prairie. In less than 2 months, that efficiency wouldn't just be a matter of comfort or fuel savings. It would be the difference between life and death. December 1888 began mild, unseasonably mild. Old-timers noticed it first. Temperatures in the low 40s, southwest winds when northwest winds should have been howling, cattle grazing placidly instead of huddling in draws and ravines. Strange weather, Jacob Steiner remarked to Anna on December 8th, watching the sky from their doorway. Too warm, too still, grandfather used to say. When December forgets to be winter, January remembers for both. Anna nodded, kneading bread dough at the table inside their hay-wrapped cabin, which stayed comfortable with barely 2 hours of fire in the morning and 2 hours in the evening. Should we lay in more wood? Already done, Jacob said. 12 cords, stacked and covered. More than we need, even if it's bad. But as December wore on, the mild weather persisted. By the 3rd week, neighbors were joking about a winter holiday. Temperatures still hovering in the upper 30s, no significant snow, conditions so benign that some families were actually using less firewood than usual. Thomas Bradley, whose cabin typically consumed a cord of wood every 10 days in December, was burning less than half that rate. He rode past Steiner's place on December 20th and couldn't resist a jab. "How's that hay palace working out, Jacob? Must be nice and toasty with all that insulation, but seems like you wasted your time this year. Mildest December I've seen in 18 years. Could have built normal and saved yourself 3 months of work." Steiner was splitting kindling near his woodpile. He paused, looked up at the sky, pale gray, featureless, pressing down like a ceiling, and then at Bradley. "You ever see geese flying north in December, Thomas?" Bradley frowned. "What? 2 days ago. Flock of Canada geese, maybe 40 birds, flying north. Against season. Against sense." Steiner returned to splitting wood. "Animals know things we've forgotten. When they act strange, I pay attention. Bradley laughed. You're reading goose flight patterns now? Next you'll be predicting weather from how your chickens roost. My chickens stopped roosting in the coop 3 days ago, Steiner said quietly. They're roosting in the hay wall gap, pressed tight together. They've never done that before. The laughter died in Bradley's throat, but only for a moment. Then he shook his head and rode on. Old superstitions. Old world nonsense. This was Nebraska, not the Bavarian Alps, and weather patterns here follow their own rules. But Steiner wasn't the only one noticing strange signs. At the general store in Broken Bow, the proprietor mentioned to customers that the Pawnee families who still lived along the river had moved their winter camps 2 miles inland and built them lower to the ground than usual. Saw Old Chief running elk, he said. Asked him why the move. He just pointed at the sky and said, too quiet. Storm sleeping. On December 28th, the temperature rose to 46 degrees Fahrenheit. Positively balmy. Some families actually opened their windows to air out their cabins after weeks of being closed up. Jacob Steiner closed his shutters tighter and added another layer of hay to the north-facing wall. The barometric pressure, though no one in Custer County had instruments to measure it, had been dropping steadily since Christmas. The mild southwest winds that had dominated for weeks began to falter, then die completely. On January 2nd, 1889, the air went utterly still. Steiner stood outside his cabin that evening, watching the sun set behind a bank of gray-white clouds building on the northwestern horizon. The temperature was still 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Calm, quiet, the kind of evening that invited complacency. Anna, he called through the door. Check the stores. Beans, flour, salt pork, everything. I want to know we can stay inside for 2 weeks without opening that door. 2 weeks. She appeared in the doorway, puzzled. Jacob, it's barely winter. We've got plenty. Check anyway. Please. Something in his voice made her comply without further question. By that evening, they'd verified their supplies, brought in extra water in buckets and jugs, and moved the chickens into a reinforced hutch built against the hay wall where radiant heat from the cabin would keep them from freezing. Thomas Bradley, meanwhile, was running low on firewood. The mild weather had made him lazy, and his usual supply for the season was half what it should have been. But no matter, he'd cut more next week when he had time. The weather wasn't going anywhere. On January 3rd, the temperature dropped to 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Normal for Nebraska winter. Nothing alarming. On January 4th, it dropped to 28 degrees Fahrenheit. The northwest wind returned, light at first, then building steadily through the afternoon. By evening on January 5th, the temperature had fallen to 22 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind was gusting to 25 miles per hour. Still manageable, still within the range of normal frontier winter. But Jacob Steiner stood at his window, watching the sky, and said to Anna, "Tomorrow. It comes tomorrow. How do you know?" "The clouds. See how they're not moving? They're building. Stacking. That's not weather passing through. That's weather arriving to stay." He was right. On the morning of January 6th, 1889, the temperature in Custer County, Nebraska, was 18 degrees Fahrenheit. By noon, it had fallen to 4 degrees Fahrenheit. By sunset, it had plunged to minus 12 degrees Fahrenheit. And the storm that would later be called the Great Die-Up was just beginning. The worst winter in 50 years had arrived. And while Jacob Steiner's family settled in behind 18 inches of compressed prairie hay and 2,000 pounds of warm river stones, his neighbors were about to discover that their conventional cabins, built the right way, the modern way, the way frontier experts insisted was proper, were catastrophically inadequate for what was coming. Now, before we get to what happened next, take 2 seconds and hit that like button if you're finding this valuable. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because the next chapter reveals exactly how cold it got, how much would each family burn to try to stay alive, and the precise temperature difference between Steiner's crazy hay cabin and the expert-built structures around him. The numbers are going to shock you. Subscribe now so you don't miss it. January 6th, 1889, 11:47 p.m. Thomas Bradley woke to a sound he'd never heard before, a deep, grinding roar that seemed to come from the earth itself. For a moment, still fogged with sleep, he thought it was thunder. Then the cabin shook. Not from an earthquake. from wind. The temperature had dropped 30 degrees in 6 hours. He stumbled out of bed, feet hitting floorboards so cold they burned like ice. The cabin's cast-iron stove, which he'd loaded with wood before bed, was still burning. He could see the orange glow through the draft holes, but the interior temperature felt barely above freezing. His breath clouded in front of his face. He threw open the stove door and shoved in more wood, cottonwood, burning fast and hot, and cranked the draft wide open. The flames roared up, and he could feel heat radiating from the stove's surface. But within 3 feet of the stove, the warmth vanished as if devoured by the cold pressing in from every wall. Outside, the wind shrieked. Bradley moved to the window and wiped the frost from the glass. What he saw made his stomach drop. Snow, not falling, flying. Horizontal sheets of it, driven by wind so powerful that it scoured the landscape bare in some places while piling drifts 8 feet high in others. The barn, 40 yards from the cabin, was invisible. The woodpile, 20 yards away, might as well have been in another county. And the cold. Even through the glass, even inside the cabin, he could feel it, a presence, a physical thing pressing against the walls like a predator testing for weakness. By dawn on January 7th, the temperature at the Broken Bow weather station, the only official recording station within 80 miles, registered minus 31 degrees Fahrenheit. With a wind chill, effective temperature was somewhere near minus 65 degrees Fahrenheit. This wasn't weather. This was an extinction event. Across Custer County, families woke to a nightmare. Cabins that had seemed solid and well-built in October were now revealed as little more than wooden tents against a killing cold. Chinking cracked and fell out. Wind found gaps around door frames and window sashes. Heat poured out through log walls and shake roofs as fast as fires could generate it. The Bradley cabin, considered one of the better-built structures in the region, had an interior temperature of 34 degrees Fahrenheit, despite a roaring fire that consumed a full cord of wood in the first 24 hours, more than Bradley typically burned in a week. His children huddled in blankets next to the stove. His wife wrapped hot stones from the fire in cloth and placed them in the children's beds. They rotated who got to stand closest to the stove, because being more than 5 feet away meant shivering uncontrollably. And the storm didn't stop. January 7th, minus 29 degrees Fahrenheit. January 8th, minus 34 degrees Fahrenheit. January 9th, minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit with sustained winds of 40 miles per hour. Livestock began to die. Cattle that had survived a dozen Nebraska winters froze, standing up in their pastures, literally unable to generate enough body heat to combat the cold. Chickens froze in their coops despite being sheltered. Wells froze solid. The North Loup River, which rarely iced over completely, became a highway of solid ice 3 feet thick. Bradley's woodpile, which should have lasted until March, was half gone by January 10th. He tried to ration, banking the fire at night, letting the cabin cool to conserve fuel. But his youngest daughter, age 4, woke crying from the cold, her lips blue, her fingers stiff. After that, he kept the fire roaring around the clock. On January 11th, he ran out of cottonwood and started burning his furniture. A chair, a small table, the bed frame from the room his oldest son had slept in before joining a cattle outfit down south. Anything that would burn. The cabin's interior temperature never rose above 41 degrees Fahrenheit. Meanwhile, 3/4 mile to the east, behind 18 inches of compressed prairie hay, Jacob Steiner's family was living in a different reality entirely. On the morning of January 7th, when the cold first struck, Steiner had risen at his usual time, stoked the small stove with split oak, not the fast-burning cottonwood his neighbors preferred, but dense hardwood that burned slow and steady, and set a kettle on to boil. The interior temperature of his cabin was 64 degrees Fahrenheit. He'd burned the stove for 3 hours the previous evening and hadn't touched it since midnight. Yet the thermal mass buried around the perimeter, those 2,000 pounds of river stones, now fully charged with heat from weeks of gradual warming, was radiating stored BTUs back into the living space at a rate that almost matched the heat loss through the walls. Almost. Steiner's cabin was losing heat, of course. No structure is perfectly sealed. But the 18-inch hay walls were so resistant to thermal transfer that the interior temperature dropped only about 0.8 degrees per hour overnight, slow enough that the residual heat from the previous evening's fire, plus the radiant heat from the thermal mass, kept the space comfortable. When he lit the morning fire, the temperature rose to 67 degrees Fahrenheit within an hour. His family ate breakfast at the table wearing normal clothes, not bundled in blankets. Not huddled around the stove. Normal clothes. And a May bread. The dough rose properly in the ambient warmth. The children did their lessons. The chickens in the external hutch, warmed by radiant heat leaking through the cabin wall, continued laying eggs. By January 9th, when the temperature outside hit minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit, Steiner's cabin was maintaining an interior temperature between 63 degrees Fahrenheit and 68 degrees Fahrenheit, with just 4 hours of active fire per day, 2 hours in the morning, 2 hours in the evening. For hours of fire, 16 ounces of oak per hour. Total daily wood consumption, approximately 50 pounds. Thomas Bradley, in his expert-built conventional cabin, was burning 280 pounds of wood per day and still couldn't keep his family warm. Steiner was using 18% of the fuel and maintaining conditions 5 times more comfortable. The numbers were undeniable. The physics were irrefutable. But no one knew yet, because the storm had isolated every homestead into its own private battle for survival. On January 12th, the temperature bottomed out at minus 41 degrees Fahrenheit, the official record for Custer County. Some unconfirmed reports from remote homesteads claimed minus 47 degrees Fahrenheit. That night, Thomas Bradley made a decision that probably saved his family's life. He couldn't reach town. The drifts were impassable, the wind still deadly. But Jacob Steiner's place was only 3/4 of a mile away. If he could get there, if the old German would take them in, he bundled his family in every piece of clothing they owned, wrapped blankets around the children, and at first light on January 13th, when the temperature had warmed to minus 28 degrees Fahrenheit and the wind had dropped to 15 miles per hour, they abandoned their cabin and fought their way east through thigh-deep snow. They arrived at Steiner's door 40 minutes later, frost-covered and shaking. Jacob opened the door to them wearing a wool shirt and suspenders. Behind him, the interior of the cabin glowed with warmth and lamplight. The smell of coffee and bread drifted out. Bradley stared. Then he started to cry. "I was wrong," he said. "God help me, Jacob. I was wrong about everything." Steiner pulled them inside without a word, and it was already setting out bowls of hot soup. The Bradley family stayed for 6 days, until the storm finally broke on January 19th. During that time, they experienced what survival was supposed to feel like. Not desperate rationing and huddling for warmth, but actual comfort, maintained with less fuel than they'd have believed possible. When Bradley finally returned to his own cabin, he found it had dropped to 19 degrees Fahrenheit inside during their absence. The residual fire had died. Everything was frozen solid. If they'd stayed, they might not have survived. But Steiner's cabin, which they'd mocked as primitive and foolish, had kept them not just alive, but genuinely warm through the worst cold snap in half a century. The lesson was written in the numbers, in the wood consumption records, in the temperature differentials that couldn't be denied or explained away. Sometimes the old ways aren't old because they're obsolete. They're old because they work. The storm broke on January 19th, 1889, but the cold lingered for another week. When neighbors could finally move between homesteads again, digging through drifts, checking on families, taking stock of the damage, the full scope of what had happened began to emerge. 17 homesteads within a 50-mile radius of Broken Bow had been abandoned during the storm. Not because the families wanted to leave, but because their cabins had become uninhabitable. Fires couldn't keep pace with the cold. Wood piles ran out. Families fled to town or to better-built neighbors, or in 3 tragic cases, they didn't make it out at all. The Hendricks family, 8 miles north of Steiner's place, had frozen to death in their cabin on January 13th, found later that week huddled together in blankets, their stove cold, their woodpile exhausted. The father had tried to burn the furniture, then the floorboards, then finally couldn't generate enough heat to matter. The county livestock losses were catastrophic. Estimates range from 60% to 80% of all cattle in the region. Horses, pigs, chickens, anything exposed to the elements for more than a few hours simply died. But the human toll could have been far worse. And the reason it wasn't, the reason more families survived, came down to a simple fact that Thomas Bradley was the first to acknowledge publicly. Jacob Steiner's crazy, hay-covered cabin had outperformed every conventional structure in Custer County by a margin so wide it couldn't be dismissed as luck or coincidence. On January 27th, when most families had recovered enough to venture out, Bradley organized what he called a winter builders meeting at the Broken Bow General Store. 14 men showed up, every carpenter, mason, and experienced builder within riding distance. Bradley stood before them and did something that required more courage than facing the storm. He admitted he'd been wrong. "I'm going to say this plain," he began, his voice carrying through the crowded store. "I've built 14 cabins in this county. I thought I knew what I was doing. I thought Jacob Steiner was a fool when he wrapped his place in hay like a damn haystack." He paused, looking down at his hands. "My family almost died in my cabin. We burned through it like it was kindling. We couldn't stay warm. Meanwhile, Steiner's family and mine, when we sheltered there, stayed comfortable burning less than a fifth of what I was going through." He looked up, meeting the eyes of the other builders. "I measured it. I'm not guessing. Steiner burned 50 pounds of wood a day and kept his cabin at 65 degrees. I burned 280 pounds a day and couldn't get mine above 42. That's not a small difference. That's the difference between survival and death." One of the other builders, a man named Hutchins who'd lost most of his cattle, spoke up. "So what are you saying, Tom? We should all wrap our houses in grass now." "I'm saying we should stop dismissing techniques just because they look primitive. I'm saying that old German knew something about staying warm that we forgot in our rush to build modern frontier cabins. And I'm saying if we don't learn from this, we're fools." The room went quiet. Then Jacob Steiner, who'd been standing in the back near the stove, spoke for the first time. "It's not magic," he said simply. "It's insulation and thermal mass. My grandfather taught me. His father taught him. In the Bavarian highlands, people have been building this way for 400 years because it works." He walked to the counter and sketched a rough diagram with a piece of charcoal on butcher paper. "Thick walls trap heat. Stone underneath holds heat and releases it slowly. Small space, easy to warm. Shutters on windows at night. It's not complicated. It's just different from what you're used to." Over the next hour, Steiner explained the principles, not in terms of R values and BTUs, which hadn't been formally defined yet, but in practical language everyone could understand. Thick is better than thin. Stone holds heat longer than wood. Compressed is better than loose. Small is easier to heat than big. By the end of the meeting, 11 men had committed to modifying their cabins before the next winter. Some would add hay walls to existing structures. Others would rebuild entirely using Steiner's principles. 2 men asked if they could apprentice with Steiner during the construction season to learn the technique properly. Thomas Bradley was the first to commit. By late summer of 1889, 17 modified or new cabins within a 50-mile radius of Broken Bow incorporated some version of Steiner's design. Not all went as far as 18 inches of compressed hay. Some used 12 inches, some used a combination of hay and sod, but all embraced the core principle: insulation and thermal mass, integrated into a compact, tightly sealed structure. The winter of 1889 to 90 was milder than the previous year, but still tested the new designs. And the results were consistent across every modified structure. Fuel consumption dropped by 40% to 60%, interior temperatures rose by 12 to 22 degrees Fahrenheit, and families reported levels of comfort they'd never experienced in a frontier winter. Bradley's modified cabin, with 12 inches of hay insulation added to the existing log walls and 1,200 pounds of stone added beneath the floor, used 110 pounds of wood per day during the coldest week, less than half his previous consumption, and maintained an interior temperature of 58 degrees Fahrenheit. Still not as good as Steiner's, he admitted to anyone who asked, but good enough that my children sleep warm and my wife doesn't have to choose between cooking and heating. By 1892, the technique had spread beyond Custer County. letters to relatives, travelers passing through, and word-of-mouth recommendations carried the knowledge to homesteaders across Nebraska, into Kansas, and eventually into the Dakotas. A technique that had been mocked as primitive and foolish in November 1888 was being actively sought out and copied by 1892. Not because it was trendy or new, but because it had been tested under the worst possible conditions and proven undeniably superior. Jacob Steiner never took credit or sought recognition. When asked about it, he simply said, "I didn't invent anything. I just remembered what worked." But the numbers told the story that humility wouldn't. During the Great Die-Up of January 1889, conventional frontier cabins, 250 to 300 pounds wood slash day, interior temps 38 to 45 degrees Fahrenheit. Steiner's hay-insulated cabin, 50 pounds wood slash day, interior temps 63 to 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Fuel efficiency, 82% reduction thermal comfort, 20 to 25 degrees Fahrenheit. Warmer survival outcome, 0 casualties in Steiner's household or among those who sheltered there. The math was simple. The physics was undeniable. The results spoke for themselves. And, perhaps most importantly, the technique was accessible. You didn't need expensive materials or specialized tools. You needed hay, which grew wild across the prairie. You needed willows for binding, which grew along every creek. You needed stones, which were everywhere. You needed knowledge and labor. The knowledge had been there all along, carried in the memories of immigrants who'd survived European winters for centuries. The labor was something frontier families had in abundance. What they'd lacked was the willingness to listen to someone who built differently, who remembered differently, who trusted old knowledge over new assumptions. It had taken the worst winter in 50 years to teach them that lesson. Some lessons, it seems, can only be learned the hard way. By the spring of 1890, Jacob Steiner's cabin had become something unexpected, a pilgrimage site. Families traveled from as far as 80 miles away, from Kearney, from Grand Island, even from the newly settled regions up near the South Dakota border, just to see the hay-covered structure that had survived what conventional cabins could not. They came with notebooks, with questions, with skepticism that needed visual proof before it could transform into belief. Steiner welcomed them all. He walked visitors around the perimeter, explaining the compression technique, demonstrating how tightly packed the hay was, showing them the stone foundation that served as thermal mass. He answered questions about moisture management, about fire risk, about rodent control, all the concerns that Thomas Bradley had raised 2 years earlier, all the objections that experience had proven unfounded. "Does the hay rot?" they asked. Steiner would pull out a section from the lower wall, grass harvested in September 1888, now 20 months old, and show them fibers still strong, still dry, still intact. Compressed tight, ventilated top and bottom. No standing water, no rot. This will last 20 years, maybe 30. What about mice? He gestured to the willow binding, spaced every 8 inches in cross-hatched layers. Too dense. Mice can't tunnel through compressed hay the way they tunnel through loose straw. We've had no problems. Fire risk? This one made Steiner smile slightly. Take this grass. Try to light it with a match. Visitors would try. The compressed hay, packed so tight that air couldn't circulate through it, wouldn't catch fire from a match flame. It would char on the surface, but without oxygen penetrating the mass, it wouldn't sustain combustion. You'd need sustained, intense heat, like a building already fully engulfed, to ignite the wall itself. Loose hay in a barn? Very dangerous, Steiner explained. Compressed hay in a wall? Safer than you think. But the real convincing happened when visitors stepped inside. Even in late spring, with no fire burning, the cabin maintained a remarkably stable temperature. Cool in the heat of the day, warm enough at night that blankets were sufficient without any additional heating. The thermal mass, now cycled through an entire winter of charging and discharging, had reached equilibrium with the seasons. It moderated temperature swings in both directions. Anna Steiner served coffee to visitors at the same table where her family had eaten warm meals throughout the worst cold snap in 50 years. The children showed off their schoolwork, completed by lamplight in a cabin that never dropped below 60 degrees Fahrenheit, even when outside temperatures hit 40 below zero. The evidence was everywhere, and it was impossible to dismiss. Thomas Bradley became an unexpected evangelist for the technique. Having modified his own cabin and experienced the dramatic improvement firsthand, he now actively encouraged other builders to learn from Steiner's example. Some saw this as Bradley admitting defeat. He saw it as finally learning to build properly. "I spent 20 years building cabins that worked," he told a group of new homesteaders in the spring of 1891. "They kept people alive. But Jacob Steiner built a cabin that worked better, and I was too proud to see it until circumstances forced the lesson on me." He gestured toward his own modified structure, visible through the window of the general store where they were meeting. "That cabin uses half the wood it used to, and keeps my family twice as comfortable. That's not defeat. That's progress. And progress means admitting when someone else knows more than you do." By 1893, the technique had evolved beyond simple replication. Builders across the region were experimenting with variations, adapting Steiner's core principles to different materials and circumstances. Some used cattail reeds instead of prairie hay, common in marshy areas, equally effective when dried and compressed. Others incorporated layers of sod between hay sections, creating a hybrid wall with even greater thermal mass. A few innovative builders in the Sandhills region used compressed native grasses mixed with clay, essentially creating a primitive form of what modern builders would call clay straw or light straw clay construction. The adaptations proved that the principle was sound regardless of the specific materials. What mattered was the physics: thick insulation, minimal thermal bridging, integrated thermal mass, compact design. A homesteader named Carl Wesson, building a new cabin near Callaway in 1894, incorporated everything he'd learned from studying Steiner's design, plus innovations of his own. He used 16 inches of compressed hay, added a double-wall earth berm on the north side for additional protection from prevailing winter winds, and built his thermal mass not just under the floor, but also into a masonry bench that ran along the south wall, creating a warm seating area that absorbed solar heat through the windows during the day and radiated it back at night. His cabin, tested during the harsh winter of 1894 to 95, reportedly maintained 66 degrees Fahrenheit interior temperature, while burning just 45 pounds of wood per day during the coldest weeks. Wesson had taken Steiner's lesson and improved upon it, which was exactly what knowledge transmission was supposed to look like. By 1897, nearly 40 structures across central Nebraska incorporated hay wall or hay insulation techniques derived from Steiner's original design. The innovation had spread through letters, through travelers, through the simple power of demonstrated success. But perhaps the most significant vindication came not from the number of buildings constructed, but from who was doing the constructing. In 1896, the Nebraska Agricultural College in Lincoln, now the University of Nebraska, sent a team of engineering students to study frontier construction techniques as part of a research project on rural housing efficiency. They visited conventional log cabins, sod houses, dugouts, and several examples of the hay-insulated structures that had spread across the region. Their report, published in 1897, included detailed measurements and thermal analysis. While they didn't use modern terminology like R-values, their conclusions were clear. Structures incorporating compressed grass fiber insulation demonstrate markedly superior thermal retention compared to conventional log construction. Temperature differentials of 15 to 25 degrees Fahrenheit and fuel consumption reductions of 50 to 70% were consistently observed. The report recommended that the technique be taught to future homesteaders as a standard practice for efficient frontier construction. Academic validation of what Jacob Steiner had known since 1888. By the turn of the century, the old German rancher was in his 70s. His hair had gone white, his hands had grown gnarled from decades of ranch work. But his cabin, that crazy hay-covered structure that neighbors had mocked in 1888, was still standing, still performing, still keeping his family warm through every winter. The hay walls, now over a decade old, showed minimal deterioration. The willow bindings had tightened as predicted. The thermal mass still functioned as efficiently as it had during the Great Die-Up. And when younger homesteaders asked Steiner about his success, about how he'd known what to build when everyone else had been wrong, he always gave the same answer: "I didn't know. My grandfather knew. His father knew. I just remembered and trusted what had worked for 400 years. Then he'd pause, looking out over the Nebraska prairie that had become his home. The hard part wasn't the building. The hard part was believing that old knowledge could be better than new assumptions. 17 families owed their survival during January 1889 to that belief. 40 structures incorporating the technique stood as physical proof. Hundreds of people across the frontier had learned that sometimes the most advanced solution is the one your ancestors figured out centuries ago. Jacob Steiner's legacy wasn't a building technique. It was a lesson in humility, and in a landscape that tested human survival with every winter. That lesson was worth more than any amount of modern expertise. On a cold November morning in 1902, Jacob Steiner stood outside his cabin with his grandson, teaching the boy how to evaluate hay for wall construction. The boy was 12, old enough to learn, young enough to still ask questions without embarrassment. "Why does it have to be cut before the seeds are fully ripe, grandfather?" Steiner ran his weathered hand through a bundle of big blue stem, feeling the fiber strength. "Because young grass has more flexibility, more silica in the stems. Makes it stronger when compressed. Fully mature grass becomes brittle. Brittle doesn't last." The boy nodded, absorbing this the way children absorb everything from trusted elders, not as arbitrary rules, but as practical wisdom earned through experience. "The neighbors say you were lucky, that the winter just happened to be bad the year you built the walls." Steiner smiled slightly. "Luck is what people call it when preparation meets opportunity. I wasn't lucky. I was prepared because my grandfather taught me to respect old knowledge." He gestured toward the cabin, its hay walls now 14 years old, still intact, still performing. "What I understood, what took your neighbors years to accept, is that our ancestors weren't stupid. They didn't build this way because they lacked options. They built this way because it worked better than the alternatives." This is the core lesson that the Great Die-Up of 1889 taught frontier Nebraska, though it took years for the lesson to fully sink in. Traditional knowledge isn't traditional because it's old. It's traditional because it's been tested across generations and found reliable. Modern doesn't automatically mean better. Sometimes, often, it just means different, untested, optimized for ease of construction rather than long-term performance. The frontier builders who dismissed Steiner's technique weren't evil or stupid. They were victims of a common cognitive bias, the assumption that progress moves in only one direction, that newer methods must be superior to older ones, that techniques used by primitive people in backward places couldn't possibly outperform modern American frontier construction. They learned otherwise when the temperature hit 41 below zero and their modern cabins couldn't keep their children warm. What Jacob Steiner understood, what his grandfather had taught him, what 400 years of Bavarian highland winters had proven, was that thermal efficiency isn't a matter of opinion or cultural preference. It's physics. Heat flows from hot to cold. The rate of flow depends on the resistance of the barrier. Increase the resistance, slow the flow, keep the heat where you need it. 18 inches of compressed prairie hay has enormous resistance. 2,000 pounds of stone has enormous capacity to store heat and release it slowly. These aren't folk beliefs. They're thermodynamic facts, whether you build in Bavaria in 1600 or Nebraska in 1888 or off-grid Montana in 2024. The specific materials might change. Modern builders use foam board and fiberglass instead of hay, concrete and brick instead of river stones, but the principles remain identical. Insulation slows heat loss. Thermal mass stores and releases heat gradually. Compact design minimizes surface area. Air sealing prevents convective losses. Jacob Steiner didn't know the terminology. He didn't need to. He knew the outcome, which was all that mattered. And when the worst winter in 50 years arrived, his family stayed warm while conventional cabins failed. Not because of luck or magic, but because he'd built according to principles that had been proven reliable across centuries of real-world testing. There's a broader lesson here that extends far beyond frontier cabin construction. In our modern world, we're often too quick to dismiss traditional practices as primitive, outdated, or ignorant. We assume that because we have advanced technology and scientific understanding, everything our ancestors did must have been inferior. But traditional knowledge exists in a feedback loop with survival. Techniques that didn't work got people killed and weren't passed down. Techniques that did work kept people alive and became tradition. That doesn't mean all traditional knowledge is perfect or that we shouldn't test it against modern understanding. It means we should approach it with respect and curiosity rather than automatic dismissal. Jacob Steiner's hay walls worked because they embodied principles of building science that wouldn't be formally codified until decades later. His ancestors had discovered those principles through trial and error, through bitter winters that killed families using inferior methods, through generations of refinement. When Thomas Bradley dismissed the technique as Highland ignorance, he was really revealing his own ignorance, not of building techniques, but of epistemology. He didn't understand how knowledge is created, tested, and validated across time. One brutal winter taught him otherwise. By the time Jacob Steiner died in 1909 at the age of 84, the hay wall technique had spread across multiple states, had been documented by agricultural colleges, and had saved countless families from the kind of suffering that the winter of 1889 had inflicted. His original cabin stood for another 23 years before finally being dismantled in 1932 when the property changed hands. The hay walls, after 44 years, were still intact, still dry, still functional. Some of the river stones from the thermal mass foundation were salvaged and used in a new building. They're probably still there, still storing heat, still performing the function that Steiner designed them for nearly a century and a half ago. The lesson outlived the man. The knowledge outlived the structure. And the principle that traditional wisdom often contains advanced understanding we've forgotten or never learned remains as relevant today as it was in 1888. In our current era, when power grids fail, supply chains break down, and people are rediscovering the necessity of self-reliance, Jacob Steiner's story offers more than historical interest. It offers a template. When modern systems fail, and they do fail regularly, the knowledge that sees us through is often the knowledge our ancestors preserved through generations of survival. Not because it's romantic or nostalgic, but because it's been stress-tested under conditions far harsher than most of us will ever face. An 84-year-old German immigrant taught Frontier, Nebraska, that lesson in 1889. The question is, are we willing to learn it in 2024? Because the next time the power goes out for a week, the next time a winter storm overwhelms modern infrastructure, the next time you're facing survival conditions with limited resources, the difference between suffering and comfort, maybe even between death and survival, might come down to whether you're willing to learn from old knowledge that's been dismissed as primitive. Jacob Steiner built a cabin covered in hay, and his neighbors called him a fool. Then the worst winter in 50 years arrived, and his primitive structure outperformed every modern cabin in 200 miles of prairie. The thermal data was undeniable. 82% fuel reduction, 25-degree temperature advantage, 0 casualties. But the real lesson wasn't written in degrees Fahrenheit or pounds of firewood. It was written in humility. The humility to recognize that sometimes the wisest thing you can do is shut up and listen to someone who's been doing things differently and doing them better for longer than you've been alive. The humility to admit that your expertise might be incomplete, your assumptions might be wrong, and the old man you dismissed as ignorant might actually be the only one in the room who truly understands what's necessary for survival. The humility to build with hay when everyone else is building with pride. That's what Jacob Steiner understood. And 14 years after the great die-up, standing with his grandson in the November cold, teaching the next generation how to compress prairie grass and select river stones, he was still teaching that same lesson. Respect the knowledge that kept people alive when survival wasn't guaranteed. Trust the techniques that have been proven across generations. And never, ever dismiss traditional wisdom as primitive until you've tested it against the worst conditions reality can deliver. Because when health freezes over, and eventually it always does, the difference between dying and surviving might come down to whether you were smart enough to learn from the people who figured this out 400 years before you were born. Now, before you go, I need you to do 3 things. First, hit that like button if this story taught you something valuable about survival, building science, or the wisdom of not dismissing traditional knowledge. Second, subscribe and turn on notifications because we've got dozens more stories like this. Frontier innovations, forgotten techniques, traditional knowledge that outperforms modern methods. Every video is packed with practical information you won't find anywhere else. Third, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from and whether you've ever used traditional building techniques or learned survival skills from elders. I read every single comment, and your stories often become the inspiration for future videos. The Great Die-Up of 1889 taught Nebraska that old knowledge isn't obsolete, it's proven. Jacob Steiner's hay-covered cabin stood as physical proof that sometimes the most advanced solution is the one your ancestors figured out centuries ago. Don't let that lesson die with history. Pass it on. Share this video. Teach someone younger. Remember what works, because the next winter that tests us might be right around the corner. And when it arrives, you want to be the one who built with wisdom, not the one who built with pride.